Her cruel mother-in-law imprisoned her in the basement while she was pregnant, believing her husband, a Civil War soldier, had died. But he was alive, and no one knew until he came back. The wind moved like a hush over the open plains, soft as a mother's breath against the brow of a sleeping child. Evening sunlight draped itself over the land in golden ribbons, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods and breaking against the wooden bones of a house that had forgotten how to smile. This house stood alone, hunched and gray on the edge of nowhere, with a roof that sagged like a tired back and windows clouded by time. It did not welcome, nor did it threaten. It simply endured. Inside, quiet ruled. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that comes after something has broken and no one dares speak of it. The floorboards creaked under the slow, measured steps of Hester Langley, who moved like a ghost that still believed it owned the place. Her face was carved from stone and frost, not old exactly, but hardened by years that had worn her softer parts away. She held a teacup in hands that never shook, though they had buried more than one hope in the hard western soil. She moved through the parlor without glancing toward the cellar door. That door, which had once led to pickled peaches and salted pork, now led to silence, shadows, and secrets. It was locked. She always checked the lock before sleep. Tonight would be no different. Beneath the floor, where light came only through the thinnest cracks between the planks, Marian Langley sat curled like a fern in the cold dirt. She pressed a hand gently against her swollen belly, speaking not in words but in rhythm, a lullaby carried in the thump of her heart, slow and tired. Dust clung to her cheeks and her lips were cracked from air too dry and water too rare. She had been there long enough to stop counting. Days had melted into one another, like candle wax on a hot plate. Her thoughts came in flickers now, not lines. But she remembered. She remembered when the wind carried laughter through these walls. When Eli, her husband, had come home with arms that knew how to hold joy. He had been her stillness in a world that shouted. A soldier once, returned from the horror fields of the East, but never cruel, never hard. The telegram that announced his death had arrived with a government stamp and a stranger's apology. Marian had clutched it like it might burn through her palms. But it wasn't the paper that seared her, it was the silence that followed. That silence had given Hester all the room she needed. "You'll want a pack," the older woman had said, voice as crisp as snapped twigs. "Widow or not, it ain't right for you to be here alone. And with a child on the way, people will talk." Marian had blinked, slow and unsure. She had thought the land was hers now, hers and Eli's. She had thought wrong. "There's a place downstairs," Hester had added later. "Just for now. Safer, with the wind and all. You look so pale these days." She hadn't fought. Maybe she should have. But Marian was tired, not just in her bones, but in her spirit. Grief had made her pliable. And when the door closed behind her with the cold metallic clink of a key turning, it was too late for protest. Since then, the days had folded inward like dying petals. Hester brought her water in a tin bowl once every other day. Bread when she remembered. But mostly, there was the dust and the cold, and the low ache in Marian's back that reminded her time was nearing. She whispered stories to the baby sometimes. About fields of wheat taller than a man. About Eli's laugh. About the shape of clouds on a summer day. She spoke them like prayers, offerings to whatever spirit watched from beyond the wood and stone. She wanted her child to enter the world with hope, even if born into shadow. Once, she had cried. Just once, when she thought the baby stopped moving. But the faint flutter came back like a whisper, and she'd smiled in the dark. Above, Hester poured herself a cup of coffee and watched the sun bleed out behind the hills. She did not speak to Marian. She did not answer questions from the neighbors. She had told them that Marian left, ran off to find her sister out east. No one questioned her. Why would they? Hester had lived here for 30 years. Marian had barely lasted 3. Hester considered herself a woman of survival. She had buried her own daughter in a winter so cruel the ground refused to yield. She had watched a husband drink himself into rage, and later, into the grave. Hardship had taught her rules. Softness gets swallowed. And Marian, for all her kindness, was soft. Too soft to raise a child alone, too soft to protect the name Hester had spent decades upholding. The basement wasn't cruelty. It was mercy in her eyes. Mercy before scandal. Mercy before shame. But mercy never came in the form of chains. And walls, no matter how thick, couldn't stop truth from growing. Marian hadn't seen the stars in weeks, but she still felt them. She imagined them blinking like sleepy eyes far above her prison. Sometimes she reached toward the ceiling, fingertips brushing splinters, as if she might grasp the light if she reached long enough. Sometimes she dreamed of rivers and rain, of washing her face in cold mountain water. Other times, she dreamed of Eli, not the way he looked, but the way he made her feel. Safe, heard, whole. Once, she heard a voice above her. Not Hester. A girl's voice. Laughing. Skipping. She pressed her ear to the wood and listened. The girl was probably no older than 10 or 11. A neighbor, perhaps. For a moment, Marian thought to call out. But what if the girl told Hester? What if Hester stopped bringing bread? So she swallowed the hope like medicine and stayed silent. The house creaked as the wind picked up. Somewhere, a shutter slapped against siding. Marian closed her eyes. Her child kicked softly, as if reminding her, still here. She whispered again, this time with more conviction. Your papa used to hum when he didn't have words. I think that's where I learned it. There are things that live in sound, even if you don't know what they mean. The baby pressed back against her palm. I will get us out, she murmured. I don't know how, but I will. The night deepened. Above, Hester put out her lamp and settled into bed with a sigh like a closing door. The prairie wrapped the house in cold arms, and the stars blinked on, distant and silent. The wind carried no answers. But it carried Marian's vow. In the cellar, she shifted her weight and leaned against the wall. Her hand moved across the dirt beside her, searching until she found the charcoal stub she had saved. She began to draw on the stone, lines, loops, shapes of things remembered. A tree. A man's face. A bird mid-flight. The baby kicked again, a rhythm inside her, like a second heartbeat. Like company in the dark. She did not know that far off, beyond the blue hills, Eli Langley was very much alive. She did not know he'd buried comrades and stitched his own wounds and read every letter she'd ever sent 100 times until the pages tore. She did not know he'd been making his way home, one aching mile at a time. But some part of her, the same part that refused to give up, the part that kept drawing hope onto stone, believed he wasn't gone. Not really. That kind of love didn't vanish. It waited. It held on. And above her, unseen, a crack in the floorboard widened just enough to let in a sliver of starlight. It touched her cheek like a fingertip. She smiled. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a horse's hoof broke through the silence of morning. The house sat still, unbothered by the wind that rattled the shingles or the dust that rose like ghosts from the prairie. Its bones, bleached gray by seasons of sun and sorrow, held together with the tenacity of things too stubborn to die. The land around it was wide and open, but the walls inside seemed to close tighter with each passing day, shrinking into themselves like a mouth swallowing its own tongue. Inside, Hester Langley moved through her days with mechanical resolve. Her hands, veined and practiced, folded linen, scrubbed counters, stirred pots of thin stew. She did not speak to herself, nor to anyone else unless required. There was a rhythm to her silence, a purpose in her control. She had learned long ago that grief could be domesticated if you kept your routines sharp enough. Grief, after all, had tried to drown her once. She had fought back with vinegar and rules. She rarely looked toward the cellar door now. She didn't need to. She trusted the lock, trusted the thickness of wood and the silence below it. Marian's sounds had grown quieter over time, more infrequent. That was how it always happened. People adjusted to darkness if you gave them long enough. Even birds forget to sing when the sky is taken from them. Marian did not forget. She clung to memory like a root in dry soil, desperate for water. Her body had grown weaker, and the ache in her spine became a constant companion, but her mind remained sharp. She remembered the taste of cinnamon tea, the sound of Eli's boots at the door, The softness in his voice when he read her lines from his worn poetry book. The way he had looked at her, not with hunger, not with expectation, but with deep, steady awe, like she was something sacred he didn't quite understand. That memory lived louder than her captor's footsteps. The cellar had become a world of small rituals. Marian counted cracks in the ceiling, rearranged the stones around her to spell imaginary names, whispered lullabies to her unborn child with a breathy tenderness that made the shadows feel like family. She rationed the crusts Hester gave her, chewing them slow, letting them soften on her tongue before swallowing. Hunger gnawed at her but didn't define her. What defined her was the will not to disappear. She had stopped expecting kindness from above. But kindness came anyway, one afternoon, as a voice. A creak. A rustle. Then a whisper, carried through the floorboards, so faint she thought it might be her imagination. Hello. Marian froze. The word felt like light. Her fingers tightened around the ragged shawl covering her shoulders. Is someone down there? The voice came again, small, unsure, but alive. She moved toward the source of the sound, pressing her mouth against the seam where two planks didn't quite meet. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I'm here. A gasp from above. Then silence. Then the whisper again. Who are you? My name is Marian, she said, each syllable cracking from disuse. I live here, or I did. There was a pause, then the sound of a child's voice, softer now, close to the floor as if the speaker had knelt. My name's Lila. My family's farm is west of here. I bring milk to the lady upstairs sometimes. Marian felt her breath catch. A child. Of course. That explained the voice, the innocence wrapped in its tone like ribbon. Can you help me, Lila? She asked. A long pause. Then, she said you left. That you went east to have your baby with your sister. I never left, Marian whispered. She locked me down here. More silence. The kind that builds behind young eyes trying to understand cruelty they've never had to carry. I have to go, Lila whispered at last. But I'll come back. I promise. And she did. The next day, and the one after that. She came when Hester was out back tending her bitter little garden, or in town trading dried lavender for lamp oil. Lila would kneel beside the house, her voice slipping between cracks like morning light. She told Marian about her brothers, who threw stones at tree trunks for fun. About her mother's singing voice. About a calf born last week with a crooked leg and a sweet nature. And Marian, in return, gave stories, soft, wide ones about rivers and wildflowers and love that waited in silence. She never told Lila everything. The girl was too young to carry the full weight. But in their shared whispering, Marian felt something return to her, not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. Above, Hester began to notice the missing milk. She asked fewer questions than most women might. Suspicion flickered in her like a dying candle but never fully ignited. She assumed Lila was a greedy child or that some wild cat had made off with the jar. She did not know that beneath her feet, Marian had begun to smile again. Still, each day brought more urgency. The baby was coming. Marian could feel it in the pressure in her hips, in the way her body pulsed like a clock winding down. She had no idea what day it was. She marked time by movement, the baby's, her own, the sounds overhead. She could feel herself nearing a breaking point. The light Lila brought wasn't enough to carry her through birth in a dark cellar. I need help, she whispered one evening, her breath trembling against the boards. Lila sounded older that day. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was something else. I know. I'm thinking of someone who might listen. Don't tell Hester. I won't. Marian pressed her hand to the floor above her, palm open, as if offering trust. From the other side, there was no touch. But she heard Lila's breath hitch, and that was enough. Hester remained unaware, walking the house in her iron-gray silence, folding napkins that no one used, boiling tea no one drank. She hummed sometimes, a tuneless thing, neither melody nor memory. Her world was orderly, her lies seamless. The neighbors didn't visit much. Hester had a way of making people feel unwelcome without saying a word. She liked it that way. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. She had not always been like this. There had been a time when Hester believed in softness. But softness had betrayed her. First in the form of a daughter who coughed herself into the grave. Then in a husband who drank away the last of their savings. She had grown tired of waiting for the world to be fair. Marian had reminded her too much of that forgotten tenderness. Of a version of herself that had once loved poetry and flowers. That weakness, she'd told herself, had no place in this house anymore. But even walls reinforced with bitterness can't keep out what's meant to bloom. That evening, after Lila's footsteps faded into the distance, Marian laid back and placed both hands on her stomach. The child within her shifted, not in pain, not in protest, but in rhythm, as if listening. She sang then, soft and low, a lullaby her own mother used to hum. The notes were cracked and quiet, but they filled the space like candlelight. In that moment, the cellar didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a womb, a place of beginning. The wind outside softened. The stars, unseen, blinked into being one by one. Upstairs, Hester lit a single lamp, the flame flickering uncertainly. In the space between the floorboards, dust floated, and time held its breath. Marian didn't know if help would come, but she knew she had been heard. She knew her voice had not disappeared. And sometimes, that was enough to keep breathing one more night. Far east of the Langley homestead, past the gray plateaus and the canyons that swallowed the sun, a man rode beneath a sky stitched with clouds. His coat hung loose over his frame, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and his face bore the kind of quiet that only survivors carry, not joyless, but stripped of illusions. His name was Eli Langley, and he had been to hell and back in blue uniform, then lost to paper and ink by a clerk who mistook a breathing man for a buried one. The bullet that should have ended him had not. It tore clean through his side during a charge at Gettysburg, left him bleeding beside a field of crushed violets and shattered limbs. A farmhand named Cyrus dragged him from the pile and nursed him in a forgotten loft, where his fever fought for weeks against the pull of death. When Eli finally stood again, the war had shifted elsewhere and the world had moved on. He had not died, but news of his survival never outran the death notice stamped with a wax seal and sent westward. 4 weeks, he remained in Pennsylvania, watching seasons change from a borrowed window, trying to rebuild muscle and purpose. Each night he wrote to Marian, his fingers trembling not from fear but from want, the want of her voice, her hands, her calm. He told her everything, the things he'd seen, the faces he could no longer forget, the guilt that clung like damp wool. But he never mailed the letters. Something inside him, pride, perhaps, or shame, convinced him she had moved on. A young widow, beautiful and kind, with family out east who might have taken her in. He imagined her beginning again, hair braided, belly round, surrounded by softness. He didn't want to haunt her doorstep like a ghost risen too late. Still, he kept the letters. Folded and refolded. Some were stained from the rain, others from the ink that bled when his hands shook too hard. He read them to himself when the silence grew too long. Then one morning, as spring crept in with its green fingers and birds returned to perch on wire fences, he made up his mind to go home, not as a soldier, but as a man. Home was still far away, but each mile he traveled felt like shedding a layer of doubt. The closer he came, the more the memory of Marian rose in him. Her laughter in the morning, the way she cradled books as if they were kittens, the way she had whispered his name like it was made of honey and hope. Marian, meanwhile, was counting time in heartbeats. The child stirred beneath her ribs more often now. It wasn't kicking, it was shifting, moving with slow intention, like it knew the walls of the cellar were not wide enough to meet the world. Her own body ached under the weight of both pregnancy and despair, but her voice remained steady. Each day, she spoke aloud to the baby, reciting bits of poetry, lines from memory, even fragments of Eli's old letters. She had only a few of them now, the one she had carried in the pocket of her apron the day Hester closed the cellar door. The ink had faded, but the words still hummed with life. "My dearest Marian," she whispered one evening, tracing the letters with her fingertip, "I saw a red bird today, and for a moment I thought of you in that faded dress with the blue flowers. You were laughing. I could hear it, even though I was so far away." She closed her eyes. "I could hear it." Lila returned as often as she could. The girl was quiet by nature, But something about Marian's voice made her bolder, like she was carrying a secret treasure and knew its worth. She began bringing scraps, half a biscuit, a piece of cheese, a strip of cloth soaked in cool well water. Each offering was given without expectation. Marian received them with trembling gratitude. "I told my brother I saw a fox," Lila whispered once. "That's why I come over here. He doesn't ask much. He's busy fixing the roof." "You're very clever," Marian said, and meant it. "Foxes are clever too." Lila smiled. Her eyes had grown older in the past few weeks. Not dimmer, just more alert. She watched the world differently now. She had seen what others had missed. One afternoon, Lila crouched beside the cellar vent, her hands dusty from crawling under the porch. "Marian," she whispered, "do you think your husband is really dead?" Marian hesitated. Then, softly, "I used to believe it. But lately, I don't know. Some days, I feel him nearby. Not like a ghost. Like a breath. Like something unfinished." Lila leaned closer, as if holding her breath might keep the moment from fading. "If I could find someone," the girl asked, "someone who could help, would you want me to?" "Yes," Marian said, the word like a flame. "Yes, I would." Lila nodded, then vanished like a shadow sliding off a wall. In the distance, Eli crossed into Kansas, his boots worn thin, his horse lamed from a stumble near the river. He walked beside it now, tugging gently on the reins, muttering encouragement. He carried only a small satchel, and inside it, the stack of letters never sent. The thought of Marian reading them one day both terrified and comforted him. He wondered if she had waited, if she had remarried, if she would look at him with pity or anger, or, somehow, with love. He arrived in the nearby town of Hayesville 2 days later. Dust clung to his coat, and his eyes were sun-cracked, but the name Langley still opened doors. A shopkeeper remembered Hester. A blacksmith mentioned seeing her in town just last week, trading a jar of gooseberry jam for nails. "No sign of the young missus, though," he said, wiping soot from his brow. "Folks said she left after you passed. Shame that she was gentle." Eli didn't speak, just nodded and turned toward the plains, his pulse pounding harder than it had on any battlefield. That night, he camped under an old cottonwood, laying on his back with the letters beside him. He pulled one out and began to read aloud. His voice was raspy, but steady. "I don't know how to explain what I've seen," he said to the stars. "Men turning into bones beside me. Smoke that never clears. But I do know what brought me back. It was your face, Marian. The thought of holding it in my hands again. That's what kept me walking." Somewhere, as if by unseen tether, Marian awoke in the cellar, her hand pressed to her heart. She dreamed of water. Not the cruel kind that drowns, but the kind that kisses dry earth. She dreamed of a door swinging open, of light pouring in. Lila had not returned in 2 days, and the silence left a hole in Marian's chest. She feared the girl had been found out, that Hester had caught her listening too close. The older woman had grown sharper lately, her movements more tense, her eyes scanning corners like she expected something to unravel. But Marian held on, even when her lips cracked, even when the hunger twisted. She held on. Eli was coming. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it in her bones. And the baby, as if sensing it too, kicked once, then twice, a firm rhythm, steady as a promise. Outside, far beyond the reach of the cellar's walls, the sun crept higher over the horizon. Dust lifted from the earth in lazy swirls. A single figure on foot moved slowly across the plain, eyes fixed on a house that had once held everything dear. His hand brushed the letters in his coat. And somewhere deep beneath that house, Marian whispered one last line to the child who had waited so patiently to be born. "He's coming," she said. "I feel it." And the wind, gentle and sure, seemed to answer, as if it too had been waiting for the story to unfold. The prairie stretched quiet and flat beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, the kind of sky that held its breath before a storm. A soft breeze carried the scent of old earth and dry wheat, whispering through the cracks of the Langley house like a voice trying to be heard. The shingles rattled against the wind's fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once, then fell silent. Eli Langley stood 100 paces from the place he used to call home. The house looked smaller than memory had painted it, more hunched, more weathered, like it, too, had aged in his absence. His eyes tracked every inch, the sag in the porch rail, the missing shutter on the second floor, the soot stain above the chimney he'd once cleaned with his own hands. But it was the stillness that struck him hardest. There was no music in the windcheam Marion had hung from the eaves. No smoke curling from the stovepipe. Just quiet, thick and watchful. He tied the reins of his horse to the broken fence post and stepped onto the porch with the caution of a man approaching a grave. The door creaked open before he could knock. Hester stood in the doorway, dressed in black like always, her spine straight and chin set. For a heartbeat, she looked at him as if seeing a ghost, her face paling beneath the lines that time had etched like frost. "Eli," she said, not as welcome, but as fact. He removed his hat slowly, his voice dry from road dust. "I got home as soon as I could." Her mouth twitched, something bitter behind the eyes. "You're late." "I know," he said. "Where's Marion?" A pause. Not long, but just long enough. "She left," Hester answered, each word wrapped in ice. "Months ago. After the telegram came. Said she couldn't stay. Took her troubles east." He stared at her, the words drifting toward him like ash. "She left. She wasn't fit to stay here alone. Not in her state. I suppose she had her reasons." His eyes narrowed, something old and sharp waking in him. "Did she leave any note? Any word?" "She said her goodbyes," Hester replied too quickly, her hands tightening on the edge of the door. "There's no use stirring it up again. It's done." But Eli had learned in war how to read the things men tried to hide. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flinched toward the floor and then away again. He stepped past her without asking permission. Inside, the air was thick with dried herbs and something fainter, something wrong. He glanced around. The parlor was neat, too neat. Every book aligned, every surface scrubbed. But the hearth was cold, and a layer of dust coated the top of the rocking chair Marion used to sit in. Her embroidery basket was gone. So was her coat. But a scarf remained. Torn, faded, blue with embroidered daisies. He picked it up from the corner of the stove, where it had been stuffed halfway into the kindling bin. The threads were scorched at one end. He rubbed the fabric between his fingers, his throat tightening. This was hers. "She must have forgotten it," Hester said from behind him. "She wouldn't forget this." His voice cracked, not from doubt, but certainty. "She made it while I was away. She wore it every day." Silence stood between them like a blade. "Where is she, Hester?" Her lips pressed together in a line that once held him's but now held only contempt. "She was too soft, Eli. She needed someone to make choices for her. I did what had to be done." His blood turned cold. The floor beneath his feet gave a soft creak, and his ears strained. There it was again, a noise. Faint. A sound no louder than a breath beneath the floorboards. Not wind. Not house settling. A voice. He dropped the scarf and moved toward the kitchen, heart pounding in his chest. The cellar door stood shut, bolted from the outside. He turned the latch. "No." Hester's voice broke open like thunder behind him. "Don't you open that door." But he already had. The darkness inside smelled of earth and time. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended, calling softly, "Marion!" No answer. He reached the bottom and paused, eyes adjusting. Then, movement. A flicker. And there, curled in the corner like the last ember of a dying fire, was the woman he had not stopped dreaming of. She looked up at him, and for a long moment, the world stopped breathing. Her face was thinner, drawn. Her hands trembled where they clutched her belly. But her eyes, those eyes, still held the blue of twilight, and the moment they met his, they filled with water, not of sorrow but of belief. "Eli," she whispered, voice ragged and small. He crossed the space between them like a man possessed, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering before they touched her cheeks, her hair, her trembling fingers. "I thought I lost you," she murmured. "You never did," he breathed. Above them, footsteps pounded. A door slammed. But down here, time curled inward like a secret kept too long. "I knew you weren't dead," she said, trying to sit upright, but he steadied her gently. "You held on," he said. "You saved our child. I didn't do it alone." She glanced toward the small vent at the ceiling. "There's a girl, Lila. She brought food. She listened." He nodded, gripping her hand. "We'll thank her together. When you're safe." She leaned into him, the weight of months dissolving in the curve of his arms. For the first time in so long, her breath came without fear. He carried her up the stairs, one arm beneath her knees, the other around her back. Her hair brushed his chin, and he inhaled the scent of dust and lavender. Hester stood in the parlor, face tight with disbelief and fury. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "She would have ruined you. She already has." But Eli didn't answer. He turned and stepped out the door, the wind wrapping around them like a shield. Behind him, the house groaned as if it knew the truth had been let loose, and it would never rest easy again. He laid Marion gently in the wagon he had borrowed from town and wrapped her in a blanket. Her head rested against his chest as they began the slow ride back. No words were needed. They had survived. From the brush, a small figure stepped into view, Lila watching with wide eyes. Eli nodded to her, and the girl ran forward, slipping her hand into Marion's, silent as always, steady as ever. As the wagon rolled away, the house behind them shrank, swallowed by horizon and dusk. And though the land was dry, something in it felt ready to bloom. Eli looked at the woman beside him, the child within her stirring again. "I remembered your eyes," he whispered. Marion smiled through her tears. "That's all I needed." The sun rose slow the next morning, painting the land with the soft amber of things trying to begin again. The wind, for once, was quiet. It carried no warnings, no cold whispers through the grass, only the scent of dew and dust and something sweeter lingering just beneath the surface, as if the earth itself were relieved to finally exhale. Eli Langley stood at the edge of the porch of the old mining shack where he and Marion had taken shelter the night before. His hands were calloused and still stained with yesterday's dirt, but they no longer shook. In the cradle of his arms, he held a hammer and a strip of linen soaked in warm water. Behind him, through the open door, Marion lay resting on the cot he had made from cedar planks and old wool blankets. Her face was pale but not hollow anymore. Exhaustion clung to her like smoke, but so did life. Her belly, once heavy with silence and fear, now lay slack, and in her arms, wrapped in a faded shawl, slept a girl no bigger than a loaf of bread. The child had come swift and wild in the early hours, just as thunder began to whisper along the far ridgeline, as if nature itself had been waiting for the moment. Hope. That was the name Marion whispered with cracked lips and wet lashes when she first held her. Eli had only nodded, too full to speak. There was something sacred in the name, as if it reached backward and forward at once, stitching together what had been torn. Eli didn't believe in much anymore. Not the kind of faith his mother had once tried to tuck into his collar. But when he looked at them now, the world felt less like something to endure and more like something to tend. He stepped outside into the golden hush and began nailing the last board across the broken window of the shack. It wasn't a home yet, but it would be. He was still working when he heard the slow approach of hooves. 3 riders came up the slope, their silhouettes tall and narrow against the light. The lead wore a deputy's badge, his coat dusted with travel. Behind him rode Lila's older brother, Elijah, and Sheriff Kincaid, a man known more for his quiet justice than his speed with a gun. Eli straightened, wiping his palms against his trousers as they dismounted. "You Langley?" the sheriff asked, voice low and even. "I am." "We heard some things." His gaze drifted past Eli, toward the doorway, where Marion now stood, holding the infant in her arms. Her posture was upright, but her eyes were guarded, the kind of gaze a woman carries after months of watching everything be taken from her. She said nothing, but the sheriff removed his hat. "I'd like to hear your side if you're ready," he said gently. Eli nodded, stepping aside so they could enter. Marion sat down slowly, shifting the baby into the crook of her elbow. Lila's brother remained near the wall, arms crossed tight, eyes darting like a boy trying to understand too many adult things at once. The sheriff, on the other hand, listened without interruption as Eli and Marion spoke. First one, then the other, each word heavy but sure. They told it all: the telegram, the basement, the days without light, the girl who brought food and hope. Marion's voice didn't crack until she mentioned the way Hester had stopped bringing water near the end. Eli's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her reclaim her voice. The baby slept through it, mouth twitching now and then like she was already dreaming of something better. When they finished, the room was quiet. Outside, a hawk screamed across the open sky, circling once before vanishing. "She's still in the house?" the sheriff asked. Eli nodded. "She hasn't left since," Marion added. "I think she believed no one would come." The sheriff sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "Some people think silence is a kind of power. But truth catches up, one way or another." He turned to leave, then paused. "We'll need you both to give a full account in town. Not just for justice. For clarity. Rumors move fast." "We'll be there," Eli said. The men left as slowly as they came, their dust hanging in the air long after the hooves faded. Eli returned to Marion's side. She reached for his hand, their fingers tangling in the quiet. Later that afternoon, they took the wagon back to the Langley house. It stood unchanged, as if the sun had forgotten to warm its walls. The garden was dry, the porch broom still leaning against the doorframe. A lone crow sat on the roof, watching. Sheriff Kincaid approached first, his badge glinting in the light. He knocked once, firm and without hesitation. When the door creaked open, Hester stood there, shoulders straight, lips pressed into that same pale line. "I heard you coming," she said. "We're here to speak on behalf of Marion Langley," the sheriff replied. "And on account of confinement without law or warrant." Hester didn't flinch. She wasn't right. Not after he died. She needed watching. "Is that what you call it?" Eli asked from behind the sheriff, stepping into view. "She needed love. She needed support. You locked her in the dark like she was nothing." "She was weak," Hester snapped. "She cried every night for weeks. She would have lost the child if I hadn't." "She didn't lose the child," Marion said, voice rising behind them. "She survived despite you." Hester looked toward her, and for a second, a brief, flickering second, something cracked in her eyes. Not remorse, perhaps, but recognition. A memory of her own daughter. The one who had died in winter, who had wept quietly in her fever, whom Hester had tried and failed to save. But the moment passed. "You have no idea what I've given to this land," Hester whispered. "What I've buried to keep this family name from shame." "Names don't mean anything when you bury people with them," Marion replied. The sheriff stepped between them. "You'll come with us. There'll be a hearing." Hester didn't resist. She stepped forward, hands folded, eyes ahead. She passed Marion without looking, but her fingers twitched slightly as she walked by the child wrapped in her arms, a glance of something buried so deep it couldn't quite bloom. The house emptied. The echo of footsteps faded. Marion stood still for a long time before walking inside. The air was thinner now. Not pure, not yet, but lighter, like windows had been opened in rooms long closed. Eli walked with her, taking slow steps through the house. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Every doorway they passed was a reminder. Every beam, every stair, a monument to what they had come through. That night, they didn't return to the shack. They stayed. The house was no longer Hester's. Eli pulled out the old letters, the ones he had never sent, and burned them in the hearth, one by one. Not in anger, but in ceremony. The words had served their purpose. They had carried him through the miles. But now Marion was here, and she deserved new words. They slept together in the parlor, the baby between them, firelight casting slow shadows on the walls. The weeks that followed were quiet, but not still. Neighbors returned. Some brought food. Others brought apologies, none owed, but freely given. Lila came often, her hair in braids, her eyes bright. Marion gave her the scarf Hester had tried to burn, and Lila wore it like a badge. The trial was brief. Hester didn't protest the charges. She answered questions in clipped phrases, neither pleading for mercy nor denying the truth. When the verdict came, 6 months at the county house with mandatory care and observation, she nodded once and said, "That's fair." She never returned to the Langley homestead. Marion and Eli planted sunflowers that spring. They tore down the cellar door and replaced it with open stairs. Marion lined the walls with shelves, filled them with jars and books and blankets. It became a nursery, a place of warmth. Hope grew fast. She cried loud and laughed louder. Her hair came in dark, her eyes pale, a storm and a sky all at once. And one summer night, when the stars hung low and warm in the velvet sky, Marion rocked her daughter on the porch and whispered, "You came from the dark, but you were never born of it." Eli leaned against the post, his eyes on the horizon. The wind played through the grass, gentle and full. He looked at Marion and spoke as if to her soul. "You saved yourself, you know." She smiled. "No, I was seen. And that was enough." And somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, not mournful, not lonely, but strong. A sound of passage, of forward motion, of time choosing to move forward. The dust had settled, and the truth stood. A settler widow was enslaved by a cruel oil tycoon, until a Comanche chief bought her freedom and made her his wife. The prairie breathed like an old creature, slow, dust-lunged, and tired from too many years of fire and forgetting. The sun sagged low across the western sky, pouring its last golden blood across the land as if mourning something only it remembered. A woman walked through it alone, her figure blurred by heat, shimmer, and memory. Her dress, once ivory, now clung to her knees in streaks of mud and engine oil. Her hands, red and raw, clutched a locket, not for hope, but for habit. Angelina Bell O'Sullivan was 36 and did not count years anymore. Time had stopped for her the day her husband's shadow vanished over the ridge and never came back. That was 5 springs ago, or maybe 6. The wind was the only one who truly knew, and it wasn't in the mood to share. She had not buried him, not really. There'd been no grave, no body, only the echo of a rifle and the silence afterward that stretched like an empty road. They had come to the west for a new beginning, she and Samuel, pulled by flyers promising land and freedom, a place to grow roots deeper than the ones poverty had snapped from beneath them in Tennessee. He had been gentle, a carpenter with sawdust always tucked into his beard. He never raised his voice and built her a rocking chair before he even built their house. She had believed in that chair, believed in him. When the raiders came, no one warned them. No one protected them. The law was a rumor in those parts, and the prairie didn't take sides. Samuel went to reason with them, empty hands raised, but men who come to steal don't listen to the soft-spoken. She remembered the sound of the door slamming behind her and the cold barrel pressing to her neck before everything turned to ash. A man named Jedediah Rusk found her 3 days later, blood-dried and dazed, and said he was saving her. He dressed his words in kindness, offered her a room in his estate, food from his table, work in exchange for shelter. But the way he looked at her made her skin shrink. That first night he called her his little widow. That name clung to her tighter than any shroud. Rusk's home wasn't a home at all. It was a fortress perched above a sprawl of oil rigs that bled the land dry. Everything there smelled of sulfur and rot. He was the sort of man who crushed cigars under his heel like small animals, who polished his boots with spit and threats. His hands were soft, too soft for someone who claimed to build an empire, and they hovered near Angelina too often. But he never struck her. He didn't need to. He was patient in the way predators are, letting his generosity ferment into obligation. She cooked. She cleaned. She washed the linens that stank of smoke and greed. She served his guests in the parlor with downcast eyes. She was never chained, not literally, but every corner of the house was a cage. Once, she tried to run. Got as far as the station before one of his men dragged her back by her braid. Rusk didn't yell. He just smiled and said, "You ain't ready to be alone out there, Angelina Bell. She didn't try again. There were small mercies. A boy named Tommy Birch who worked the stables, nearly deaf, clumsy as a new calf, would sometimes sneak her biscuits wrapped in his handkerchief. He never spoke more than a few words at a time, but he'd grin at her like she was the sunrise. Then there was Miss Evie, who ran the upstairs girls and carried the weight of 20 years in corsets and bad men. Evie once slipped Angelina a piece of lace from New Orleans and said, "Just so you remember you're still a woman. Not just a ghost in his house. But even ghosts can feel." That evening, Angelina stood at the edge of the oil fields, watching the drills gnaw at the ground. The machinery roared like hungry dogs, and the sky turned a bruised kind of violet. She pressed the locket tighter to her palm. Inside was a picture, faded and cracked, of Samuel smiling awkwardly, his eyes half closed. It didn't look like him anymore. Time had warped his face into someone else's husband. Behind her, the bell rang, Rusk's way of summoning the house staff. She didn't move right away. Let the air hold her a little longer. A gust of wind blew her hair across her face, and for a moment she imagined herself a hawk, not elegant but sharp, capable of flight, if only she remembered how. When she returned inside, Rusk was in the dining room, toasting two men in tan dusters who smelled of sweat and ambition. Angelina poured their whiskey with quiet hands. One of the men let his gaze linger too long on her collarbone. Rusk leaned back and laughed. "She's mine," he said. "Found her near dead. Put her back together with my own hands. She's loyal, ain't you, Angelina?" She said nothing, just poured another glass. Later that night, she sat by the back steps with her knees drawn up. The stars were timid behind the smoke. Her fingertips traced the wood grain beside her, wishing it was Samuel's skin. Wishing she could forget how he smelled, cedar and pine soap, and the way he used to hum when fixing things. She hadn't heard a tune since. From the darkness, Tommy shuffled over, holding a biscuit wrapped in cloth. He held it out without words. She took it, their fingers brushing. "You're kind," she whispered. He shrugged and shuffled away. Angelina stared at the biscuit. Didn't eat it. Just held it as if kindness had weight. The next morning came hard and hot. Rusk told her there'd be visitors from out east, men with money in their pockets and women on their arms. She was to serve, smile, and be seen. That afternoon, a procession of horses arrived. Angelina watched them from the window, her hands trembling as she adjusted her apron. That's when she saw him. A man rode at the back, his horse dark as wet earth. He wore no silver, no polished buttons, only buckskin and stillness. His hair was long and threaded with feathers. His face bore lines carved by sun and silence. He dismounted without noise and said nothing as he entered. The others called him Nickema. A trader, they murmured. A chief. Comanche. He walked past her without pause, but his eyes, those eyes like winter rivers, caught hers for the briefest heartbeat. It wasn't a look of desire, nor pity. It was recognition. As if seeing something buried inside her that even she had forgotten was there. She turned away too fast. Felt breathless. That night, she couldn't sleep. The biscuit still sat by her bed. She didn't touch it, only stared out the window, thinking of eyes like rivers, and a wind that smelled not of oil but of pine. She didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Not enough to save her. Just enough to wake her. And that's how the story begins, not with a rescue, but with a look. A moment. A breath. Something soft cracking beneath the weight of years. The prairie was still burning, yes. But somewhere, far off, came the scent of rain. The days grew longer after his arrival, though the sun kept its same routine. It was not the earth that changed, but the weight of the hours. Angelina felt it first in her chest, as though something dormant had shifted in the soil of her spirit. She couldn't name it yet, wouldn't dare speak of it, but from the moment the Comanche trader stepped across the dusty threshold of Jedediah Rusk's estate, the air began to move differently. His name, they said, was Nickema. No one dared to say much else. He was a man without fuss, without sharp words or grand gestures. Traders came and went, each one greased with charm and the need to fill the room with stories. But this one carried silence like other men carried pistols. It wasn't an emptiness, but a fullness, the kind that pulled sound inward and made others quieter just by being near. He didn't look at Angelina again that first day, not directly. Yet she felt his presence like one feels the moon, not looking up, but knowing it's there, silver and watchful. He walked among Rusk's oilmen and visitors with a slow, measured grace, his moccasins making less noise than the wind slipping through the halls. He wore his hair tied low, a single braid brushed with gray and bone. When he spoke, it was in few words and only when needed, his voice steady as river stone. Angelina observed from the edges, as always. Rusk had made her part of the scenery, expected to serve but not be seen. She moved like furniture, like breath, like wallpaper. And yet she began to notice Nicoma's gaze resting, not long, but long enough, each time she entered a room. It was not possessive, not hungry, just present. That evening, while the oilmen drank and hollered over cards, Angelina cleared glasses near the fireplace. The room blurred with heat and the stench of whiskey. Rusk laughed too loudly, his gold rings glinting in the lamplight as he slapped one man's back and nudged another's leg under the table. Nicoma sat apart, unmoved by the ruckus, fingers drumming softly on the table. Not impatient, not bored, but thinking, perhaps, in rhythms no one else could hear. When Angelina reached for an empty tumbler near him, her fingers brushed the rim just as he did. A single touch. No more than a blink in time. But in that fleeting moment, she felt something transfer. Not energy, not heat, but acknowledgement. Her breath caught. He didn't flinch. He simply looked up, eyes steady, quiet as a prayer. And she looked back. Later, in the corridor outside the servants' quarters, Angelina found something left on the windowsill. A carved feather, small and simple, whittled from soft wood, its edge smooth as river-polished stone. No name, no message. Just the feather. She stared at it for a long time before placing it gently in her apron pocket. She didn't ask who had left it. Some things were best left unsaid. The days that followed passed in peculiar harmony. Rusk grew more boastful, eager to impress the Comanche guest. He bragged of his lands, his oil wells, the reach of his business back east. He spoke as if he had tamed the land itself. But Nicoma listened with an unreadable expression, neither impressed nor dismissive. It became clear, in time, that his silence unsettled Rusk more than any argument could have. The tycoon's words began to spill faster, louder, like someone trying to fill a canyon with gravel. One morning, Angelina stepped out to the well with a tin bucket. The sun had not yet crested the hill, and the horizon still wore its blue-gray veil. The ground was damp with dew, the air clean for once. As she turned the handle to raise the water, she noticed him sitting on the low stone wall beside the livestock pen. He wasn't watching her, not exactly, just sitting there, breathing in the morning. She could have gone back inside. She should have. But something made her pause. "You're up early," she said softly, unsure why. He looked over, slowly, and nodded once. "The wind is clean before men wake." Angelina gave a small smile. "It doesn't stay clean for long around here." Nicoma rose from the wall, not abruptly but with the easy motion of someone who trusted the ground. He walked closer, hands resting at his sides, palms open. No threat, only presence. "Do you like it here?" he asked. The question struck her like an ember. No one had asked her that in years. Rusk only told. The others assumed. She answered with the truth. "I feel buried most days." He looked at her then, really looked. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the space between them, a space heavy with unsaid things. "You are not buried," he said. "Not if you can still reach toward the sun." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Her throat tightened with something like grief, but older, more layered. She turned away, lifting the bucket. He didn't follow. Didn't press. Just walked back toward the open plain. That night, she sat with the carved feather in her palm, brushing its surface with her thumb. She didn't understand what was happening inside her. It wasn't longing. Wasn't even hope. It was something quieter, something that hummed like a forgotten melody starting to surface. Miss Evie found her there and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You look like you're thinking thoughts you ain't ready to say." Angelina smiled faintly. "What if I've forgotten how to speak them?" Evie took the feather from her hand, turned it over, and gave it back. "Then listen, and let them find you again." 2 days later, Rusk held a gathering in the Great Hall. Cigars, liquor, papers to sign, deals to discuss. He was entertaining the idea of opening another drilling site farther north, near Comanche grazing lands. Angelina stood behind him, refilling glasses as men with names like Collier and Braxton argued over acreage and bribes. Nicomas sat at the end of the table, arms crossed. At some point, Rusk gestured toward Angelina and said, half-drunk, "This one's part of the place now." Took her in when no one else would. Like taming a stray. The room chuckled. Angelina's hand tightened around the decanter. She wanted to scream, throw it, run. But she did none of those things. She simply stared at the wall, willing herself to become invisible again. But Nicomas looked up. His voice cut through the din like a low drumbeat. "She is not a stray. She is surviving." Silence fell. Rusk laughed uneasily. "Well, now, you get philosophical out here, do you?" Nicomas did not smile. "You talk much, but the land listens to the quiet." No one responded. No one dared. That night, Angelina found a second feather on her windowsill, this one darker, carved from cedar. She held it to her chest, her heartbeat slow and deep. She knew now that she had been seen, not as property, not as pity, but as a person, a soul with a shape. And though she still lived under Rusk's roof, something within her had already stepped outside. The story was changing, not in leaps, but in footsteps, not with fire, but with kindling. And somewhere, far out beyond the oil fields, something waited, not to rescue her, but to walk beside her, if she could only remember how to move. The wind howled differently that morning, not wild, not loud, but restless, like a breath held too long. Angelina stood by the parlor window, her hands buried in the folds of her skirt, watching clouds gather in slow bruises above the oil rigs. A storm was building, but it wasn't in the sky. Rusk had been pacing since dawn, muttering about a guest from Chicago who was arriving to inspect the new drilling site. His voice carried down the halls like a rusted bell, all bark, no melody. Angelina knew the pattern. Important visitors meant more whiskey, more leering eyes, and less sleep. For her, it meant tighter corsets and heavier silence. She laced her boots slowly, mechanically, like winding a clock she no longer wanted to keep time with. Her mind wandered to the carved feathers tucked in her drawer, and to the man who had placed them there. Nicomas had left the estate 2 days ago, returning with his horses and trade goods to a camp beyond the northern ridge. His absence pressed against her like a hand around her throat, not painful, but always there. By afternoon, the house thickened with heat and tension. The visiting investor arrived, pale, round-faced, sweating through his vest. Rusk greeted him with open arms and a sharp grin. They spoke of profit margins, mineral rights, and the future of the frontier. Angelina moved through the rooms like a shadow, refilling glasses, picking up ashtrays, nodding politely at jokes that smelled of cigars and cruelty. Later, she overheard them near the study. The door wasn't fully closed. "She's pretty," the investor said, tone dripping with entitlement. "That one who brings the bourbon." Rusk chuckled. "Angelina? A relic. But if you've got a taste for ruin, she's quiet. Loyal enough." "You rent her out?" "Not usually," Rusk said. Then, after a pause, "But for you? Could be arranged." Her body froze before her mind did. Her ears rang. It wasn't rage that bloomed. Not yet. It was shame. Familiar, cold, and heavy as wet wool. She pressed her back to the wall outside the room and closed her eyes. She felt the locket in her bodice, still carrying Samuel's photo, and for the first time, she didn't reach for it. It felt too far behind her. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. That night, she found herself on the back steps, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes searching the horizon as if she could summon someone with just her longing. The stars were late in rising, reluctant behind thick clouds. She whispered to them anyway. "I don't want to die in that house," she said, voice raw with truth. "Not with my name sold like sugar." A shuffling sound broke the dark. Tommy emerged from the barn, eyes wide beneath his mop of hay-colored hair. He held out a cloth bundle, a biscuit, like always, but something else wrapped in the folds this time. A horse charm, carved from bone. Angelina looked up at him, heart stuttering. "Tommy, do you know where he is?" The boy nodded once, slowly. "Can you get to him?" Another nod. She pressed the charm into his hand, folded his fingers around it. Tell him I am still here. But I am not his. Not anyone's. Please." Tommy didn't speak. He just turned and disappeared into the dark, his small shape swallowed by the whispering grass. The next morning passed with aching slowness. Rusk whistled as he dressed, giddy with power. He told Angelina to wear her green dress, the one with the tight sleeves and low collar. She obeyed, but her eyes did not lower. Not this time. She served the investor lunch with the weight of fire in her spine. When his hand brushed her hip, she didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She looked him in the eye and said, with a voice like frost on glass, "I would not touch you even if I were buried beside you." He blinked, laughed, thinking it a joke. Rusk said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Evening crept in, heavy with unspoken things. The investor retired early, disappointed, drunk. Rusk stood alone on the porch, a bottle in one hand and fury in his bones. Angelina stood in the kitchen, her fists clenched, a kitchen knife forgotten on the table. Her heart beat like hooves. Then came the sound of horses. Not many, not loud, but with the steady rhythm of purpose. She moved to the front parlor just as the door swung open and the wind carried him in. Nickema. He wore no war paint, no feathers in his braid tonight, only the dust of the road and the stillness of a mountain. Behind him stood 3 of his men, quiet, watchful. The room shifted around him like it knew who truly belonged in it. Rusk stepped forward, incredulous. "What's this?" Nickema laid down a small leather satchel. It opened with a dull thud, pelts, silver beads, trade tokens, and one more item, a medallion round and worn, marked with the crest of a fallen cavalry commander. A relic, a thing of meaning. "For her," Nickema said. Rusk laughed, short and sharp. "You think you can buy her? She's not for sale." "She is not your possession," Nickema replied. His voice did not rise, but it held the power of storms. "She stays here by your will, not hers. That ends now." Rusk sneered, stepping closer. "You think showing up with trinkets makes you her savior?" Nickema didn't move. "I do not come to save her. I come to honor her decision." He turned to Angelina then, and the entire room fell away. His eyes found hers, not in pity, not in ownership, but in waiting. A silent question. Angelina stepped forward, slowly, each breath like breaking chains. "I want to leave," she said. Her voice was soft, but it echoed. Rusk stepped forward, his hand rising, not in strike, but in warning. "You walk out that door, you don't come back. I'll see to it." Angelina looked at him, truly looked, and what she saw was not power. It was wrought, hollow gold. She walked past him without pause, without flinching. She joined Nickema in the doorway. He didn't offer a hand, didn't lead her. He simply stepped aside and made room. They rode out together beneath the rising moon, neither speaking, the sound of hooves a lullaby to a long nightmare's end. Angelina didn't cry. She didn't look back. That night, they camped beneath a sky freshly cleared of clouds. The fire was small, just enough to warm hands and dreams. Nickema handed her a blanket, then sat a few feet away, watching the flames. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Angelina finally broke it. "Why?" she asked. He didn't look at her, but his voice drifted like smoke. "Because the world forgot what you are. And I didn't." She sat still for a long time, letting those words settle. They tasted like truth. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Someplace quieter than your pain." Angelina lay down, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her not as a coffin, but as something that could hold her. Something that didn't demand she be anything but alive. She closed her eyes. And somewhere, just past sleep, she began to dream, not of escape, but of belonging. The sun rose quieter on the other side of freedom. Angelina woke beneath a sky softened by dawn, the light touching her like a question rather than a command. Around her, the earth stretched in a slow exhale. No fences, no drills, just the endless hush of land breathing itself back into balance. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the air smelled of ash and sage. Tahoma stood nearby, facing east, his silhouette cut clean against the early gold. He wasn't a man of ceremony, not in the grand sense, but there was something reverent in the way he greeted the morning. As if light were a blessing earned, not owed. Angelina watched him for a moment before sitting up, fingers brushing the dirt from her dress. They didn't speak right away. The silence was no longer heavy. It was something to rest inside. By midday, they reached the village. It sat along the edge of a quiet creek, its water pale green and lit with reflections. The homes were made of timber and hide, their curves blending into the land rather than standing over it. Children ran between the gardens, barefoot and unbothered. Old women sat in shade, braiding dried corn into long golden ropes. No one shouted. No one rushed. Life here did not demand noise to feel real. Angelina dismounted with a hesitance she couldn't name. Her limbs obeyed, but her heart lagged behind. She was not used to being welcome. Not anywhere. Tahoma introduced her with no grand speech. Just a simple, quiet truth. "This is Angelina. She will be staying." There were no questions, no whispers. An elder woman with eyes as dark as burnt honey stepped forward and handed Angelina a bowl of cool water. Another draped a woven cloth over her shoulders. No one asked where she came from, only if she was tired. Angelina was more than tired. But for the first time, she felt no shame in admitting it. Over the days that followed, her body slowly remembered softness. Her hands, once cracked from soap and labor, began to mend as she worked the gardens beside Redbird, a girl of maybe 11, all knees and laughter. Angelina sewed with the women in the longhouse, her stitches uneven at first, but steadier with each evening. She learned the names of herbs that healed bruises, of flowers that lured hummingbirds. She learned to sit without bracing for command. She also watched Nikema. He wasn't always nearby, yet never far. He walked the perimeter in the mornings, checked the traps with the boys, spoke to the elders with the same tone he used for everyone. Steady, low, listening more than leading. He gave no orders, yet people moved with him. The village trusted his silence more than others trusted speeches. One evening, she found him carving beside the fire. His hands worked a piece of bone into the shape of a bear, not grand, but deliberate. "You always carve alone?" she asked. He glanced up, then back to the carving. "Some things grow better in quiet." Angelina sat beside him, knees tucked to her chest. "I used to hum. Back when I baked bread. Before everything changed." He offered her a faint smile. "Hum again." "I forgot how." He said nothing, but handed her the finished bear, still warm from his touch. She held it without knowing why it made her throat tighten. Their conversations never rushed. Words came when they were needed, not before. Angelina learned that Nikema had once had a wife, gentle, strong, lost to fever during a harsh winter. Their son, barely 5, had followed within weeks. He said it plainly, without performance, like telling the story of wind changing direction. "I buried them with cedar," he said one night, his gaze lost in flame. "So they would always smell like home." Angelina didn't answer with words. She only placed her hand over his, not to comfort, but to say, "I hear you, and I carry my dead too." They grew in the spaces between labor. She brought him woven baskets with split seams. He repaired them without comment. He left dried tobacco by her tent each morning, though she never smoked. She began humming again, first quietly, then louder, and one afternoon found Redbird and 2 other children humming along. Still, not everything softened easily. One morning, Angelina woke from a dream thick with oil smoke and broken glass. Rusk's voice had followed her into waking, slick and cruel. She walked into the woods and screamed until her voice cracked. When she returned, Nickema was waiting. He didn't ask where she'd been. Just handed her a cup of tea with a slice of honey root. "Sometimes rage is just grief without a name," he said. She nodded. "I think I had a name once. But it's been buried under all the names he gave me." He tilted his head. "What name do you want?" She looked at her hands, then at the sky. "One that doesn't tremble." He didn't reply. Just touched 2 fingers to her collarbone gently and said, "You already wear it." In time, others noticed. Grandmother Wren, the oldest woman in the village, once caught Angelina staring at Nickema across the fire and laughed softly. "Your hearts walk the same path," she said, "even if your feet do not yet know it." Angelina flushed. "It's not like that." Wren only smiled. "Love is not always like anything. That's how you know it's real." Still, they did not name what was blooming. There was no rush. The world had rushed enough. This was something meant to be grown with care, like herbs planted deep beneath frost, waiting for a kinder spring. One dusk, while the sky bled lavender, Angelina followed Nickema to the river. He was stacking stones, a slow, meditative rhythm. "What are you building?" she asked. "A place for memory. Each stone is something I let go." She picked one up, turning it in her fingers. "Do you forget them?" "No. But I don't carry them all at once." She placed the stone gently atop the others. "Then I'll leave one too." He looked at her then, and something shifted. Not a decision, but a recognition. A moment between hearts that no language could translate. That night, she didn't sleep alone. Not in the way the world might assume. No heat, no hunger, just the closeness of breathing beside someone who saw her not as broken, but brave. Their hands met in the dark, fingers weaving not in passion, but in peace. In the hush of that moment, Angelina understood something she never had before. Love wasn't always thunder. Sometimes it was a quiet steadiness, a place to sit while the storm passed. The morning brought birdsong and dew. Children giggled outside, chasing each other with berry-stained hands. Angelina sat outside the tent, braiding her hair with clean fingers. Tahoma brought her a bowl of roasted maize and sat beside her without words. She turned to him, expression calm, certain. "I don't want to forget who I was. But I don't want to belong to that sorrow anymore." He nodded once. "Then let's build something where soft things can grow." And she believed him. For the first time in her life, she truly believed. The wind changed again. It came from the south this time, thick with heat, sharper than summer should have allowed. The trees felt it first, leaves turning their bellies skyward in anxious rustles. Birds fell quiet in the middle of their songs. Even the horses shifted restlessly, nostrils flaring as if they too sensed the echo of something long dreaded, something coming. Angelina stood near the gardens, her hands sunk into the soil where she'd just planted wild garlic. The dirt was warm and alive, clinging to her fingers like reassurance. Redbird ran past, her laughter trailing like a kite, but Angelina didn't smile. Her spine knew before her mind caught up. Something was wrong. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward the distant ridge, the one that framed the village like a border between peace and the rest of the world. Before the sun reached its peak, 2 riders appeared. Dust trailed behind them like a warning. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. One wore the unmistakable shape of a soldier's coat, faded blue, buttons dulled by years but still bright enough to gleam. The other was broader, cruelly familiar. Jedediah Rusk. He rode with the same swagger as ever, as though he'd never lost anything, never bled. His beard was neater than Angelina remembered, and his skin shone with the gloss of power freshly polished. But his eyes, His eyes had gone colder. There was no wine in them now, no charm. Only hunger. The village gathered slowly, cautiously. Grandmother Wren stepped to the front, her staff in hand. Nicomas stood beside her, silent, unreadable. Angelina felt her heart shift in her chest, not out of fear, but clarity. She moved to stand between the children and the strangers, her feet rooted. She no longer trembled. Rusk dismounted as if the earth should thank him for it. He looked around with the curled lip of a man measuring property. His gaze skipped past Wren, past the others, and landed squarely on Angelina. "Well now," he said, voice smoother than a lie, "I'll be damned. I almost thought you'd disappeared for good." Angelina didn't speak, didn't move. He clicked his tongue and stepped forward. "I'm here on legal business. You ran off without permission. That makes you a fugitive, Angelina Bell. You know I got rights over you. Signed contracts. Witnesses." She could feel the eyes of the village pressing around her, but not in pressure, in support, in silence. She looked at Rusk, at the lie he wore like a well-fitted coat, and let the quiet grow until it broke. "I was never yours." His nostrils flared. "You were under my roof, ate my bread, wore my linens." "I wore chains," she said, "and I broke them." The soldier stepped forward, placing a rolled paper in Grandmother Wren's hands. Under state law, the woman is listed as a dependent of Mr. Rusk. Her departure is unlawful. Angelina turned to the old woman, voice calm but fierce. "He forged those papers. There was no consent. I never signed. I was never paid. I was kept." Wren looked at the paper for a long, still moment. Then she let it fall to the ground and turned to the soldier. "You're not standing in a courthouse. You're standing on sovereign land. What law do you carry that weighs more than her word?" The soldier looked uneasy now, sweat collecting at his temple. Rusk barked a bitter laugh. "She's just a woman with nothing. Who do you think they'll believe?" And then Nicomas stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't draw a weapon. He stood between Angelina and Rusk, shoulders squared but not aggressive. "Come. Entire. You speak like you own the sky," Nicomas said. "But you forget who listens." He held something in his hand, a small pouch. He opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing the cavalry medallion. The same one he had traded once for Angelina's freedom. The same one Rusk had dismissed as sentimental. "This belonged to a man who fought your war. He died not for power, but for peace. It was given to me by his widow. She told me to use it when I needed to remind men what honor looks like." He dropped it into the dirt between them. "Do you remember honor, Jedediah?" Rusk sneered but said nothing. Nicomas' voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You can turn back now. Or you can step forward and face something your wealth can't quiet." The tension grew like thunderclouds before a flash. Rusk's eyes flicked between the villagers, gauging their numbers, their will. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He turned toward Angelina. "You'd choose this life?" he hissed. "Over silk and safety? Over protection?" Angelina stepped beside Nicomas. Her voice was no longer soft. It was a blade wrapped in velvet. "I'd choose truth. And if you ever knew me at all, you'd know I'd rather starve in freedom than feast in a cage." For a moment, no one moved. Then Redbird walked forward and placed her hand in Angelina's. One by one, the others followed, children, elders, mothers. A wall not built of muscle or guns, but of unity, of story, of home. Rusk's bravado drained. He muttered something under his breath and mounted his horse without another word. The soldier followed without resistance. The dust swallowed them, and they did not look back. Only when they vanished did Angelina exhale. The village exhaled with her. That night, a fire was lit in the center of the circle. Not a bonfire, but a hearth, a place for warmth, not war. Angelina sat among the others, a woven shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose down her back. She felt different. Not lighter. Not unburdened. But whole. She watched Nicoma as he moved through the circle, speaking with the elders, laughing with the children. There was something in the way he carried joy, like it belonged to everyone. When he returned to her side, she looked up at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "I never thanked you," she said. "Not properly." "You did," he said. "Every time you chose to stay." Angelina turned toward the flames. "I used to think love was rescue. But it's not, is it?" He shook his head. "It's walking beside someone when they no longer need saving." She reached for his hand. Their fingers met with the quiet certainty of rain meeting earth. No flash. Just blooming. At the edge of the fire, Grandmother Wren stood and raised her staff gently. The circle hushed. "We do not wed with laws," she said. "We wed with truth. With time. With choice." She nodded to Angelina and Nicoma. "You may speak or stay silent. Either is ceremony." Angelina looked into Nicoma's eyes. She didn't need to say a word, but she did. "I am no longer buried." And he answered simply, "You never were. Just waiting to bloom." They tied a cord between their wrists, red yarn dyed with root and ash. Not a binding. A reminder. That what held them now was not obligation, not escape, but chosen soil. The night stretched on with music and stories. Laughter carried like petals on the wind. Angelina found herself dancing with Redbird, bare feet moving through dust and memory. Her voice rose in song, the old kind, soft and steady, filled with kitchens and rocking chairs and the smell of cedar. And above them, stars gathered like old friends. Much later, when the fire had turned to coals and most had gone to their tents, Angelina sat alone beneath the open sky. Nicoma joined her, bringing a blanket and 2 cups of warmed cider. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to dream of escaping," she whispered. "Now I dream of planting things." He looked down at her with a quiet that glowed. "Then let's make a garden where grief can rest and joy can rise." Angelina smiled. And somewhere out in the world, a man like Rusk would tell stories of how he almost owned a woman once. But they would sound brittle, unreal. Because stories like Angelina's aren't told by men like him. They are whispered by wind and firelight, by the ones who endured, by the flame that does not burn, but lights the way.